Good morning.
Good morning.
Welcome to day 4 of our course on individuality and accomplishment. For the first 3 days, we have been examining various aspects of human personality and those dimensions of it which seem to be most supportive of accomplishment in whatever field we may refer to. And we've also seen some of the social conditions that bring out the potentials of human beings more fully, as Alberto was stressing yesterday, as to the social conditions that make for the fully functional person. This morning, I'd like to discuss the psychology of accomplishment from the point of view as a process. Accomplishment as a process. We've been talking about people who accomplish and the factors internally or externally that support or impede that accomplishment. But what about the process of accomplishment itself? In my opening presentation on the first morning, I put up a slide as reflected here in red, that human accomplishment is the result of the interaction between individuals, organizations, society, the environment, and life circumstances. And I think the first part, the individual part, the society part, have been very well covered in all that we discussed. Life we will come to on the last day. We have been talking about people creating organizations as instruments for accomplishment, working within organizations, whether it's the organization of a government agency like Franklin D. Roosevelt when he became president. He's not an all-powerful monarch. He's a head of an organization and has to function through the Constitution and laws and the distributed power structure of an organization. All of this is in the context of the environment, which Alberto is going to come back to later this morning. So we're trying to see a process by which all of these come together. And I'm making a statement, and I mean this statement to be somewhat provocative, if it's not, so I don't mind a little controversy about it. But this process, I believe, is essentially the same at the micro level of the individual, at the level of the organization, and at the level of the society. There's a commonality here between accomplishment at these 3 different levels. And yesterday we talked about a few attributes of it, and I'd like to come back and look at, is there really a common process to all 3, and how could we describe it? So, for individual accomplishment, for organizational development, and for the evolution of society. And we've also been talking about a process that could be common to all levels of life and all fields of life. Whether our field is a physical accomplishment, a conquest, or commercial, economic sphere, political objectives, artistic, intellectual, or whether our goals, aspirations, are for psychological, cultural, or spiritual attainment. So what we're going to discuss this morning is something that could be common to all of these dimensions. Yesterday, in discussing the dimensions of personality, I said that, to me, the most striking single characteristic of high-achieving individuals is their energy. And I quoted a number of examples of not only individuals who have high energy companies like Apple and Intel, countries that exude more energy than others, and I also commented that the energy level of a country can change over time. When I came to India the first time in 1971, even in the big cities, things were low-key. You didn't feel much intensity. Nowadays, you go even into the rural towns and you see the energy, you feel the vibrancy and dynamism of a society that's going through rapid change. Eastern Europe, 25 years ago, I remember when I drove into East Germany, East Berlin in 1989, that was 1968, the place was absolutely dead. It looked like nobody lived there. The streets were empty. There was nobody, and even if anybody was on the street, they were simply quietly walking themselves. Go to East Berlin today and see what the energy is like, and you know that the same place, the same people, under different conditions can exhibit an enormous difference in energy, and that's true all over the Eastern Europe today, certainly, and Central Asia as well. And we also mentioned yesterday that energy is generated, I said, by an aspiration. An aspiration can be for something physical or an idealistic aspiration. I was anxious for you to see the first episode of Pride and Prejudice because Mrs. Bennet is an example of a woman with an intense aspiration. She has one main aspiration in life, and that is she has 5 unmarried daughters. And this is both a great opportunity and a great pressure on her. And she will not be fulfilled until she sees all of these daughters married. And you can see how it releases her energy. The moment she hears word that a young, wealthy bachelor is coming into town, she's all alertness. She's all dynamism. She's a living dynamism trying to figure out on a campaign to see how she can get this man at least one for her daughter. So she's a common everyday example of this principle. We know energies released in response to opportunities. I mentioned yesterday the observations of many Europeans when they went to the U.S. in the 19th century and were just flabbergasted by the intensity of the energy there. And there was a good reason for that. In Europe, if you grew up in Europe and you weren't having the good fortune to be in the top 10% or 1% that own most of the land, the idea that a common ordinary person could have land and have land in good quantity was almost unimaginable. And you could go to the United States and join in a race where you could get 500 acres of land for free. And when they stopped the races, you could get it for $2 an acre. And that was at a time when the daily wage was $1. So for working for 2 days, you could get an acre of land. An acre of land was a lot in Ireland. And here landless people were coming and get 120 acres or 240 acres of their own. It was a tremendously energizing experience for the society. New opportunity can come in the form of a new technology. That's what we saw in Steve Jobs when the PC revolution started. And you know, it's interesting, in the early 80s, there were more than 200 personal computer companies started in Silicon Valley alone. But by 1985, just 4 years later, there were only about a dozen of them left. The energy, it led to this exuberant entrepreneurial activity, but the energy wasn't enough to sustain it. Energy can also be generated by challenges, and Janani's going to speak about that. Is that today or tomorrow? Tomorrow, in her presentation tomorrow. We was talking yesterday about the Great Crash and the Great Depression and how FDR, this was a country, America in the 30s was the most capitalist, country in the world, we really believe everything should be free. And yet, FDR put through a program of social welfare reform, which probably never could have been done in any other circumstances other than the great challenge that the country faced at that time. The Civil War was an example of a challenge that released enormous energy for the country. Have you ever wondered why after World War II, after the devastation of World War II, Europe went through its most unprecedented economic development? You would think after everything was annihilated, so many millions of people were killed, the infrastructure of this, including Germany, was completely destroyed, and many countries was completely destroyed, and yet the following 10 years was a period of maximum peak economic growth. In fact, in the history of the world, of the Western world, from 1950 to 1970 was a period of unprecedented economic growth. The challenge itself had broken down so many of the barriers, so many of the staid ways of living, the security that everybody had, even if it was traditional, we were secure. This is our village, this is our occupation, this is how things have always been. And it released people's energy to try to cope with the challenge, and there was unprecedented response. And energy can be released by aspiration. But energy alone is really not enough. Johnny showed on the first day the film clip from Kindergarten Cop of all the kids running around wildly in the classroom. And whether or not that would be the normal, typical thing in any classroom or not, I think it was clear that that energy was not necessarily producing anything. The kids were having a ball, throwing things up in the air and making a mess in a chaos. But that energy alone is not enough to accomplish. That energy needs to acquire a direction and focus in order to be converted into a useful energy that can generate power. You know, in physics, they say energy, when it's given a direction, it becomes a force. You've got the solar energy coming all over the place, but that energy, except it's making us either warm or perspire, and it's helping the crops grow. But unless we have a capacity to capture that energy, whether it's through a solar collector or photosynthesis, we don't convert that energy into something useful. We've got the wind blowing all over the place, and the waves blowing all over, but that doesn't mean that it's useful to us. You can have a raging river with a tremendous amount of physical energy in it, but the river itself may not be producing anything useful. It may be, but we know we can harness that energy through a process and convert it into electricity, convert it into power, convert it into something that can do work of many different descriptions. A mob on the street or a crowd is full of energy. Maybe be panicking or just celebrating and enjoying themselves, but not producing anything productively. And the leader is one who's able to take that energy and give it a direction so that it can be applied for a purpose, whether that purpose is constructive or destructive. Yesterday, Alberto, in talking about the criteria for the self-actualized person, he mentioned the importance of the sense of purpose. He particularly mentioned at that level the transcendent good, a goal that inspires people to direct their energy towards some high objective. We also talked, and Mila talked about the importance of knowledge and values. These are things, knowledge, values, goals, sense of purpose, these are things that help us direct and concentrate and focus our energy. We also know that how we focus our energy depends on our social constructions, which Alberto was talking about. Our concept of health, We may be using that energy to put people down and to make them feel ostracized, or we may be using it to include them according to the mental perspective with which we view a situation. The great leader is one who's able to mobilize that energy. Janani mentioned, I think it was yesterday, when President Kennedy came to power, and he announced, the Russians had launched the Sputnik. They were ahead of America into outer space. And he announced the goal to put a man on the moon within 10 years again, and most importantly, because that wasn't so difficult, to bring him back again. And at the time he announced that goal, there was simply no technology to get a vehicle back off the moon and get a craft back to Earth from that distance. They launched this program and involved some 45,000 organizations in the process. Everything from those who are making the rockets and the moon lander to those who are going to make the food that they can eat in outer space and figure out what to do with the body wastes and how they're going to manage it. All that was new to them. And they had a program to do it by 1970, and they actually completed it 6 months early. But it was that goal, it was that inspiring, committed goal that focused all of this energy of the nation on a particular accomplishment. We talked about Gandhiji and how he inspired the Indian masses to release their energy and direct that energy towards Indian freedom. How do you motivate people to, what do you tell the nation if they want to be free? He said, go make salt. Go to the beaches and make salt, because making salt is illegal, and salt has to be paid a tax, and by going and making your own salt, you're violating the British government in India, and you're demonstrating that you don't honor their rule and their laws. And suddenly 300 million people had a way to express their aspiration for freedom in the same way, and the British were totally, they can handle an army. They can bring their army to handle an army, but what do you do in the long coastlines of India when people are going and making salt and they're violating your authority every day by the millions? It showed his remarkable genius for creating a direction which could mobilize the energies and channel them effectively. And in that way, he really was a genius. When Steve Jobs went back to Apple, and at that time, Apple's market share had fallen to like 5% of the U.S. market, and he decided that he's going to put Apple in the music business. And 4 years later, 45% of Apple's revenue was coming from the iPod and sale of songs. Such a radical change in direction. And for him, he said it wasn't a change in direction at all. All along, for him, the business of Apple was making technology that helped people fulfill their needs. And one of those needs was music. And everything he did was to see how he didn't consider himself a device manufacturer. He considered himself somebody who meets needs, and this was one of the needs. It's very interesting if you read his biography. After they did it, Bill Gates honestly acknowledged. He said, "I just don't know how Jobs ever convinced the music publishing industry to allow him to distribute their songs, because up until that time, music was only sold by the album. You got one best hit, and you put all the other stuff on the album." And he managed to convince them that this is the future, and if they're left out, they're going to miss it. And transformed not only himself, he transformed the industry. He transformed the whole music publishing industry. He had a vision. He had a clear direction. Well, Energy and direction are very important, and I kind of think I'm using this analogy of the river and the great kinetic energy that's there in the river. If you want to tap that energy, the first thing you need to do is build a dam. And what does the dam do? It controls that energy and it directs the kinetic energy through the sluice valves so that it can be focused and handled. It converts that raw energy into a force. But that's not enough. Force itself doesn't accomplish final results. It gives us a capacity. But in order to convert it into results, we need to channel that power, that force, and make it an effective power. And that's what the hydroelectric power plant does. It takes the kinetic energy of the river, it channels it through the sluice gates, it uses the turbines to transform that kinetic energy of the motion of the water into electrical energy, and then through a complex process of systems, a very sophisticated organization, it distributes that energy to points of application where we can use it. And that's the role of organization. I had mentioned earlier that organization is made up of individual acts that are linked together into activities, into systems, into functions, into structures, so that they're all coordinated with one another and integrated with one another, so that the energy can be used effectively in a coordinated way to do many things at once. I think Gianni mentioned Ford's mass production system that he introduced in Dearborn, Michigan around 1910, where instead of building a car piecemeal one step at a time, they were simultaneously doing everything. They were assembling engines, they were assembling chassis, they were making the upholstery and the seats, all in different places, all at the same time, and bringing these through a very complex set of conveyors and systems, all so that when the vehicle, the chassis moved down an assembly line, it was getting an engine and the radiator and the upholstery, the windows, everything was going on because they were all going on at the same time and meeting at one place. This is the coordination that organization makes possible. This morning we were served eggs and the bread was coming much later. If the bread comes after the breakfast is over, it doesn't help too much. Or if the salt, the day before it was the salt and pepper came after we had finished the breakfast. That coordination is power. So, I like this analogy of the hydroelectric power plant because it shows us how we're full of energy. Human beings are full of energy. People are full of energy. But how do we harness that energy and direct it for productive purposes? This man was an inspiration for me. I mentioned yesterday that I met him. He was quite elderly at the time. But Bill Marriott started his first drive-in restaurant in Washington, D.C. in 1927. And it was just he and his wife, Annie. They invested about $5,000. They had come out from Utah. And this was the idea of a drive-in restaurant was something very new. Even driving was pretty new in 1927. There weren't that many people driving. So it was a very new idea. And after a year, he found she was doing, I don't know who was cooking and who was serving the customers, but between the two of them, they were doing pretty well. And after a year, they decided to start a second restaurant, half a mile away. And by 1932, remember, 1929 was the great crash, so that's a time when any wise person stops investing in business. But by 1932, they had 6 of these drive-in restaurants, all in Washington, D.C., at different points. And if you had met Bill at that time, you would have found he's no longer cooking the hamburgers or tending to the cash. He's running from one shop to the next all day long to be sure that the people who are cooking and serving the customers and cleaning the floor are doing it as well as he and Annie did it. And then he found that when you're running 6 shops, there's a lot of other things that have to be done. You have to be constantly hiring new people and training them. You have to be negotiating with your bank. You have to be buying from suppliers because you're buying in bulk, so you have to be looking for better quality supplies and negotiating with them. You don't have time to be in the shop all day. And he went to his lawyer in 1932 to show him the property, a new property that he wanted to buy for his 7th drive-in restaurant. And his lawyer, who knew him since the beginning, he said, "Bill, my advice to you is stop now while you're ahead." And Bill said, "Why?" He said, "Look, today you're running 6 restaurants, running yourself crazy just trying to keep up with them. What are you going to do? You're going to come back here a few years from now and you're going to have 20? How far do you think you can go?" He said, "I've seen so many people do and make the mistake that you make of thinking that their success in doing 1 or 2 or 3 can be extended indefinitely. My advice is quit while you're ahead." Well, fortunately for the shareholders of the Marriott Corporation, Bill didn't listen to them, to his lawyer's advice. He went out and did build those 20 drive-in restaurants within a few years. And in 1937, when the first commercial airline flights started to fly out of what was then Washington National Airport, and he had pilots and flight attendants who were coming by his drive-in to get coffee and sandwiches to take on the flight, he said, "Well, why are you bothering to come here? I'll bring the sandwiches and coffee to you." And he started the first airline catering business in the United States, delivering on the flights for the staff and then for the passengers as well. By early 50s, he had over 200 restaurants all over the East Coast of the United States. By that time, his Bill Marriott, his son, this is Willard, the old senior, Bill Jr. had joined the company, and they decided that they really weren't in the right business. They should be in the hotel industry. And they started to expand. Well, what happened to Bill during this time? How did he manage this? The guy who was flipping hamburgers and tending to the cash and cleaning the tables, he had to stop being the worker who did these things and become the manager who managed the people who did these things. But that wasn't enough. When you've got 6 of these or 10 of these locations, you need managers for each of the locations. You can't be running. You can run to 6 maybe in a day. You can't run to 30 in a day, especially as they get further and further apart. And you have to become the general manager who has people in each place who does the work you were doing so that you can do something you weren't doing before, like advertising, which he hadn't been thinking of, like recruiting new managers and training them, like writing systems so that everything would be followed perfectly in each. They'd all be making hamburgers the same way in each place and cleaning the tables the same way in each place with the same size servings. And he was a fanatic about these standard operating procedures. But what happens when he got into the airline catering? Suddenly he's got 2 related but separate organizations, and airline catering means it's not just in Washington. He has to do it in every site, every place where there's an airport. So he needs a general manager for his restaurants, he needs a general manager for his airline catering, and he becomes something above that, whatever title you want to give him. And so the growth of his organization is directly reflecting his growth as an individual. His growth, not just in how many hours he worked, because he was working all the hours at the beginning, but what he was doing, his capacity to learn new skills, and mostly his capacity to convert what he knew into a system so that other people could follow it. And Marriott is one of the most famous in the hospitality industry for their written standard operating procedures. We once interviewed executive of their flagship hotel in Washington, D.C., who used to work for Hilton. And we said, what's the difference between Hilton and Marriott? And he said, in Hilton, the manager's book is 1 volume. At Marriott, it's a 10-volume set because they have procedures for literally everything. If you're going into a room to make up the bed and or check whether the bed is there and check whether they've replaced the laundry bags, which once they're used sometimes don't get replaced. They have systems for everything. They have a book of SOPs for the pool, the lifeguard at the pool, which presumably he knows how to swim and save lives, but not just that. He should know about suntan lotions. He should know about other recreational activities that he can tell people about. They've got a book even for the guy who picks you up at the airport on the shuttle bus. So he can tell you about events that are going on and good movies that are in the region and so forth and so on. Because he institutionalized his own skills so that the organization could keep growing. And maybe the most interesting of these from my point of view, Bill Marriott was considered to be a genius in selecting sites for new locations, because in the hospitality industry, the site is really of absolute critical importance. And he decided in 1982 to open 300 new hotels all over the United States. That was the beginning of the Courtyard Hotel. Well, for every new hotel you want to open up, you've got to look at least 10, 20, 30, 40 sites. There's no way that one man, even if he's a genius, can go around to 300 different cities or different locations and look at 3,000 or 6,000 sites within a year or two to select them. And they all told him, Bill, this is the one area which you can't delegate it. You've got to do it yourself. And he said, it's absolute nonsense. I know what I do when I look at a site. And he wrote down and set the standards for what you do in order to select the site and what are the criteria. And they could open those 300 new hotels in a 3-year period because he knew that what he has as knowledge or skill can be institutionalized in the organization. So the organization really is an outer expression of the knowledge and skills and capabilities of individuals made manifest, made tangible. And we saw the movie clip on the first day that Janani showed us from Gladiator of how powerful the energy of the German barbarians or whatever German tribes was equal to that of the Romans. They were not lacking in motivation. They were defending their homeland. And they were brave and bold and maybe more courageous even than the Romans. But what they lacked, they had direction, they had energy, but they didn't have the organization. And therefore they couldn't convert that energy into effective power. I've been telling Alberto I'm reading a wonderful series of historical novels about Genghis Khan. I really didn't know anything about him, and it's an incredible story, and it's all documented. It seems they know a lot more about the life of Genghis Khan than they did about Abraham Lincoln before he became president. He was out in the wilderness somewhere. And it's a fascinating story because his father was the Khan, the leader of a small tribe of a few hundred families in Mongolia. And when his father died, the children, there were 4 children, the sons, should inherit the Khan's position, but they were very young. So the second in command in the village decided to exile the family from the village and take over as the Khan, which is what happened historically. Now, at that time, for any family to live on their own in the Mongolian wilderness was almost impossible to survive, for the simple reason that any 2 or 3 warriors come by and they can kill you and take your animals, and there's no way you can defend yourself in that wilderness unless you have the safety of at least a few hundred warriors in a tribe. So the whole of Mongolia was organized as small tribes. They managed to survive, and they managed to find there were lots of other individual families hiding out in the mountains for protection, hiding from the rest of the world because they knew they couldn't survive in the context if anybody found them. And he went and sought them out and created a new tribe, linking together all the rejects, all of those who were abandoned, who all readily grew because the one thing they wanted was the security of a group. And then he went to some of the smaller tribes because by that time, instead of being 10, he had 30. By the time he got to 30, he was already making progress. Then he got it to 300, which was almost the size of the tribe, the 300 warriors of the tribe he had left. Then he went to smaller tribes and said, you have to join us. There's only one tribe in Mongolia. And the 300 became 3,000. And before he was finished, they could amass 300,000 warriors under the Khan. And it became an irresistible force. He and his grandson Kublai Khan conquered all of China. They went east, they went west, they conquered Russia, they went up to Budapest, they conquered Budapest. In fact, I was telling Alberta, there was nothing between Budapest and Paris. There was no force that could resist them. They went up to the borders of India and turned around, and all of Afghanistan, and all of this, starting from 4 boys who were exiled from a village because he built an organization. It was not the kind of organization that we'd like to see more of today. It was really an organization of warriors, but highly sophisticated organization. Groups of 10,000 people, warriors divided into thousands, divided into hundreds, divided into tens, with sophisticated systems for communication. They had the fastest communication system in the world in the 12th century. They had a set of riders that could go 5,000 miles from one end of the kingdom to the other. Nothing could travel faster than they called it their YAM communication system. So at their level, military level, tremendous sophistication and tremendous power. So that's the power of organization. This is a quote from Tom Watson, the founder of IBM. He said, take away everything, but leave me my organization, and I'll be back on top in 10 years. Take away my products, take away my money, take away all our market share and everything. But if I've got my that's the real thing that produces. That's the source of my power, is my organization. So, what is organization? Let's think about it. At the social level? I've been mentioning constantly that personality is an organization, a complex, living organization that channels our human energy to accomplish purposes, transcendent purposes, or purposeful behavior. But the whole society is filled with organizations that help us channel the energy of human beings more effectively. What about language? If you think about it, language is really a networking tool. Without language, we may all be here shouting at each other, gesturing at each other, but there's no way we can coordinate our activities effectively for more than very rudimentary purposes because we don't know how to communicate. The market is a social organization, a networking organization that enables people, if I can produce carrots and you can produce rice or tomatoes or whatever it is, the market gives me an incentive to produce more carrots than I can ever eat or feed to my family because market enables me to take them and exchange them with you for tomatoes or rice or wheat or cucumber or whatever else it is. So the market energizes all of us by networking our activities together. That's the specialization that Janani was talking about. Have you ever wondered or thought about why all developments of human civilization take place in cities? Why the highlights of all developments all over the world at all time take place in city? And why people gravitate to the city to the extent that more than 50% of the world's population is living in cities in most countries, and it's going to be more in future. And one thing, of course, cities are a center of energy. They're an intense energy, and they're very attractive for that purpose. You know, sitting out in the farm is fine to be peaceful and sleep at night. But when you want something to do or want to, the city is the place with all the energy and excitement. But it's also a fantastic organization. Because if you're a farmer, I've lived out on a farm for a while in rural India, and you know, everything you want in the life, except for the food you grow, is not there. If you want clothes, if you want a tool, if you want information, if you want anything, it's somewhere else. And we once made the mistake of building a factory out in a rural town in India, which was about a 7-hour drive to the main city, Chennai, Madras at that time. And even the phones didn't work most of the time there. We used to have to send messengers back and forth to Madras to get a spare part for this or something for that, because nothing was available. But when you go to the city, everything is there. All the products made now in the world, you can find in almost every city. All the services you could possibly need, all the entertainment. So it's a networking device, a very powerful way in which society organizes itself. It may not be the optimal organization for the future. We got everybody crowded into tiny little places with high real estate and high pollution. Eventually, we've got to find a better way to distribute our capabilities out to everyone else, which is what Sears did with his wish book, with the mail order catalog. You don't have to live in Chicago to get all of the modern conveniences. You can look at the mail order catalog and buy them on your farm. He was trying to find a way to network out to the rural areas, and now we've got the internet, which enables us to do that. Every time I used to go, plan trips back to the United States so I could buy the books and things that I wanted. Now I buy it from Amazon wherever I am in the world, and they come delivered to the door. It's a networking device that helps us create new models of social organization. Money, of course, is, I think of language, market, city, money are money's most remarkable invention of human beings. Because money has enabled us to convert anything we have that's of value to other people. I may have the knowledge of a teacher, or a beautiful face, or a charming voice, or the skill at playing tennis, or whatever it is, and I can convert that into anything else of value in the society through this networking device that we call money. The money itself is totally useless. If you had suitcases full of money on a deserted island, you would quickly realize that money is absolutely useless in itself. The money only has any utility because there's somebody who's willing to exchange it for something they have. And of course, when societies undergo war and they lose their production, their currency immediately loses value, because money is really only as valuable as that which it can buy. So organization is there in all levels, in all forms. We often don't think of it that way. And of course, the ultimate organization that we have in the world today, unprecedented is, as a networking device, is the internet, which not only it integrates us at the level of information, at the level of communication, at the level of e-commerce. We can now even go and see what's happening in other cities by looking at the Google Maps and of what's going on there. It integrates us not just collectively, but now individually. Each of us can relate to our friends all over the world. Each of us can. It's an incredible advance. Not so much the technology, which made it possible, but the social organization. And I often wondered, supposing the internet had been invented, maybe it was for all I know, but supposing the internet had been invented in the Soviet Union and not in the West, it would have been the perfect instrument for George Orwell's Big Brother, to use, which of course is being used even now. Unfortunately, that's not the only use for it today. But so it depends on the values which support that organization. Okay, so organization magnifies the energy it transmits by integrating many, many different functions so that they can get results. So that we can go on the web, we can not only get information about a product, we can order that product, we can pay for that product, and we can specify to have it delivered somewhere else. These are all very sophisticated activities, and it can all be done because the organization integrates them. And there are so many types of organization now. Okay. This organization of the society is constantly evolving. It's constantly changing. Fortunately, if we were here 100 years ago or 50 years ago, that may sound, just like a theoretical statement. But we have all lived through a period where literally we can see the organization growing, the virtual organization growing before our very eyes. We know what we could do 10 years ago or 5 years ago or 20 years ago and what we can do today and how much it's empowered us. On the lines that Janani was speaking. So society is constantly evolving, now evolving at the speed where we can see it. And this organization is enabling human beings to take more and more of our energy, direct it, and coordinate it with the energies of other people. So right now we may have 30 people involved in this discussion. I meet at least one of them as far as the San Francisco Bay Area, 9 time zones away, and we can be coordinating our activity and exchanging ideas and information because of the evolution of the social organization. And we also know today that as there are gaps in our own internal organization, and in conflicts and inconsistencies and big untapped opportunities, in the first part of Pride and Prejudice, which you did or didn't see last night, they're at a dance, and Darcy, the hero's friend, asks him to come and proposes, why don't you dance with that girl, Elizabeth Bennet? She's a pretty-looking girl. And his first response is, no, nobody's dancing with her. I'm not about to give attention to a girl who nobody else thinks is worth dancing with. It turns out the greatest opportunity of his life has been presented to him at that point, but because of his social construction, that he's of a very high level of social prestige, and these are all lesser people because they're in the unsophisticated suburban rural society, his first response to the greatest opportunity of his life, which he's going to learn later, was, no, she's only tolerable. And he foolishly speaks it so loudly that she hears him and takes it out of him and makes him work for 9 months to overcome that one ill-spoken, foolish, crude, rude word that he spoke out of the foolishness of the moment. Because even when we're presented with golden opportunity, we often don't do better than Darcy in knowing it and responding to it positively. And society's full of that today. Imagine if we had taken all the opportunities that came after the end of the Cold War and fully utilized them instead of making them such a mess on not only our financial markets, but our liberation movements and so many other things, how much further along we could be today. So that's why I said it's evolving. This is a work in progress or in process. And for all the strengths it has, which I've been emphasizing to illustrate the power, we all know the loopholes, the problems, and the difficulties that happen when we don't have the right knowledge or the right attitudes or the right values to use that organization properly. The organization can destroy us as well as uplift us. And a related point, and I tried to illustrate this with Bill Marriott's example, organization not only helps us collectively do more, but it also helps each individual to develop. Because Bill Marriott had an organization, he could learn all the skills and make a tremendous personal growth in life from being a worker or a small-time proprietor to being the CEO of a multinational organization. Because the organization leaves room for us to grow and develop higher capacity. We don't all have to grow our own food. We don't all have to make our own clothes and our shoes. Because of organization, we can each develop in the area where we have strengths or where we have aspirations. So organization done rightly, and I'm not at each step going to talk about the negative side of how it can go wrong, but when used positively, as Alberto said yesterday, as an organizing structure, can help people develop, help them bring out the best, help them discover new potentials that they have. And of course, our challenge if you're an entrepreneur, your challenge is how can you bring out the best capacities of all the people in your organization? And our challenge, if you're a leader of a country, your challenge is how can you bring out the best energies of all the people in the country for their own well-being and for the prosperity of the country. And Alberto was stressing the importance of autonomy, giving that autonomy that allows energy to come out and the right values that direct that energy in a way that is not destructive along the way. And each of us as a human being, we have the same challenge. We've got energies. We've got to figure out how to direct these energies and organize these energies in a meaningful way for our own fulfillment and hopefully for the fulfillment of the people with which we relate. And I think we know it's not an easy job. Many times I may be saying something's tolerable when it's the opportunity of a lifetime because of my social construction of knowledge along the way. But there is a commonality here. We have opportunity, we have energy, we have potential, but our capacity to direct it and transform it into productive purposes is a challenge. And the last step in this process, and I'm speaking in very broad terms, is that it's not enough we have an organization. We also need the right skills to direct that power and express it perfectly. In my analogy of the river and the dam and the power plant, the skills are like the hair-thin filament of an incandescent bulb. You may have a power plant that's producing 1,000 megawatts of power. You may have a huge river and a dam and a power plant, and you may be bringing this power over 500 miles or 1,000 miles from the point of generation. But whether we get light in the room or not depends on the tiny, we don't have incandescent bulbs, fortunately, anymore, the tiny little filament in an incandescent bulb. If there's a tiny break in that filament, this energy, force, and power doesn't yield results for us. If the plug is just slightly unplugged, or if there's a tiny short circuit in the wire, we don't get the results. And so at 1,000,000 points, our capacity to convert this energy into results depends on skills. Yesterday I was giving the example of FDR addressing the country at a point, an absolutely critical point. He was known for those skills of communication. He didn't get on the radio and lecture to the people, now don't cause any trouble and stop panicking, go and put your money back in the bank. He charmed them. He called them to remember the strength of America. He called them to remember the courage and fortitude and greatness of their forefathers and how much they've accomplished. We are not people who are afraid of anything. And now it's only our fear that we have to deal with, nothing else. Be men or be American, be brave, be courageous. Go back and put your money in the bank and this problem is over. What was the skill needed? It's not enough you have the knowledge. How many people would have had the capacity to deliver that message to the public and inspire them with it? It's an intangible. So the skills, there are physical skills, in technical skills, which we all know what we have and when we lack them, and if you lack one little technical skill, you know the problem it presents. There are social skills in dealing with people, and that's an infinitely complex, subtle reality. In Alberto's profession, he knows how difficult and challenging it is to deal with people and be sensitive and perceptive and know exactly how to respond to people in the right way to bring out the best in them and help them to deal with their own challenges. There are the skills for the artist, the skills for running an organization, which Marriott learned. There are the mental skills of the mathematician or the physicist or the scientist or the thinker or the creative artist or a Jane Austen or whatever it is. So we have skills at all levels. And what we get with our energy depends on some capacity of these skills to convert energy into power for results. And there's one other important element, fundamentally important element, and that is the power of attitudes. To me, I think of skills and attitudes as complementary to a right and a left hand. Don't ask me which is which. The skills are how we channel the energy, how we control it. The attitudes determine how that energy is directed. I don't know how many of you have been to New York City and tried to go down from uptown to downtown or vice versa at different times of the day and all. But you know, if you happen to get there at a time when it's not really rush hour, the traffic lights are synchronized. And if you go at the right speed, you start at 80th or 60th, and you go down 6th Avenue or whatever it is, all the way down to Lower Manhattan. And if you really did it properly and there wasn't too much traffic, you could go the whole way without stopping for a traffic signal. And if you miss the synchronization, if you try to go too fast or too slow, you can end up stopping 60 times along the way. Or if there's a little too much traffic, so that somebody enters the intersection late and stops you along the way because he wanted to go and make a turn, you know how much confusion it can be, like the picture Janani showed of the Indian traffic jam, which is the norm in there and often in New York as well. But what are these attitudes? Attitudes are like the traffic signals. When we are presented with an opportunity, is it a red light or a green light? When Darcy was asked by his friend Bingley to dance with Elizabeth, he put up a red light. What happens when you put up a red light? When you put up a red light, you say your energy is not going to flow in that direction. Worse than that, sometimes we do flow. We offend the other person and call them tolerable, which is a pretty stupid thing to do. We not only don't accomplish our work, the only way to accomplish our work is to have an attitude that will enable our energy to accomplish. And I think if you go back to what Alberto was saying yesterday about the qualities and the attitudes of a fully functional person, like humility. What is humility? It means every time there's a discussion going on, I'm not trying to show how smart I am or how self-important I am or to put other people down. And again, if you watch the first couple of episodes of Pride and Prejudice, you'll see the first time that Mrs. Bennet's aspirations are being fulfilled, when her oldest daughter, Jane, looks to be just a half an inch away from getting engaged to Mr. Bingley, who's worth, as she never lets us forget, £5,000 a year. The first thing she does, she goes to her neighbor, Lady Lucas, and starts to brag about it and triumph over it. Unfortunately, your daughter Charlotte is so plain looking, unfortunately, she misses it out. And this is how we use the energy of an opportunity, and she converts it into a short circuit. And that short circuit comes around. It's Miss Lady Lucas's husband who warns Darcy, apparently inadvertently, warns Darcy, if you don't watch out, your best friend is going to be married to a member of the Bennett family, and Darcy gets really alarmed and takes Bingley and takes him away. It's Mrs. Bennett has contributed this by her negative attitude, by her urge to dominate. So these things we call attitudes, which are so nebulous, but if you see how those attitudes are determining whether our energy flows and how it flows at each moment. I mentioned earlier about Lincoln's remarkable attitude that if somebody offended me in the past, I have a very short memory for offense. I don't have any time for past resentments. I don't know how many people can say that. Resentment. Darcy defines himself as somebody that once he resents a person, it never changes. Contrast that with Lincoln. That no matter how many times a person offends him, if the man is willing to work with me next time and it's going to help me accomplish the purpose, I'm not going to bring an attitude from the past. It's a diametrically opposite. So these attitudes are of enormous power. And it comes out beautifully in the story, but it comes out in any of the examples that we're talking about. Like Churchill when he's made the Prime Minister of England right in the time when the Germans are getting ready to invade England. And a message comes while he's sitting in one of his first cabinet meetings. A message comes that France has capitulated to the Germans. And he has to now announce that there's no support, no opposition except England. On all sides, Netherlands, Belgium, France, they have all fallen. And he sees the message and he reads it out and says, "Gentlemen," they were all men at that time in the cabinet, "Gentlemen, France has surrendered. We are all alone. Isn't it exhilarating?" He had the courage to say, "Isn't it exhilarating? Now it's up to us." And he not only said it with a bravado, but he was able to persuade the English people that it was a privilege to fight and to die for the cause of freedom. Okay, so that's the power of attitude. I just wanted to end here with culture. What is culture? Culture is a word we use all the time. We all value it and all, but what is it really? Culture is an invisible, intangible fabric of ideas, values, symbols, customs, I'm calling them systems, mindsets, constructions, of how we channel our energy. And if it's a high culture, it helps us channel those energies in a positive way, in a constructive way, where we can live harmoniously together. It is an organization. It's not an organization like Marriott is an organization, or like the hydroelectric power plant is an organization. It's an organization of values and attitudes and capacities and skills that tell us how to function effectively with one another. And we know the difference. We know what happens when that cultural harmony breaks down. We see how the energy of a society can become so self-destructive. I was going to give you an example of another story of George Washington. I'm not going to do it because I've already spoken too much. But I just wanted to flag and say Washington was a character who I was never very inspired about. He's not been portrayed in history with great inspiration. But if you ever have a chance, I can recommend a wonderful biography. All of the points that we're talking about, that we've been illustrating with others, were just remarkably exhibited by him in his life, but not with the charisma and FDR, not even with the overt idealism of a Lincoln, but with a perfection. And I'll just cite one. Washington, when he was the commander-in-chief of the Continental Army during the American Revolution, when the Congress refused to give money, or they couldn't get the money, they didn't give food, they didn't give clothing, he had soldiers who lived through the winter with a half a blanket and no place to live and no shoes on their feet in the snow, and they were virtually starving to death. And when his officers said, let's go into the countryside and take what we need from the rich colonists and all, he said, no. We are under the authority of the Congress, and I refuse to use military power that's not authorized by the Congress. In an extraordinary situation where people's lives are at stake, he refused to use the military power. Now, how many people can refrain from using the military power regardless of the situation if it's to their advantage? He refused to use it when it was even for the sake of his own army. And that's why he became the first president of the United States, because the American colonists who had just thrown over the king were so concerned and so afraid of authority that they refused to elect somebody who might become another threat to them and use the power of a central government against them. And this was the one man who had so much demonstrated his willingness and commitment to the value of subordinating the military to the civilian authority that unanimously, he's the only president who was ever elected unanimously, and he was unanimously elected twice. And then he refused to go further. And the ultimate compliment that Washington could ever get in his life, I just wanted to show you one last slide. He got from his bitterest enemy, who was King George III, his bitterest enemy, King George III, after the conclusion of the war, Washington resigned his commission and formally handed back control of the military to the Congress. And when the king was told, the king asked, what will Washington do now that he's retired from the military? And he was told he's going to go back to his farm. And the king said, if he does that, he will be the greatest man in the world today. And that's exactly what he did. And when they wanted to call Washington to the Continental Congress where they wanted to elect a president, and after they elected him president, he didn't have the money to travel there because having worked for 8 years, fought as the leader of the Continental Army for 8 years, and he had refused even taking a salary. The local colonist tax collector came and said, you owe $500 of tax for the past few years. The man has let his whole farm and estate go to pot, and he had to borrow money to pay the taxes while he's been spending 8 years saving the country, and then he needed to borrow money to go to be inaugurated as president. Okay. Questions, comments? Sorry, I mentioned that. See if there's anything online.
Actually, fascinating everything, but especially this one, I didn't know of Washington. For some regard, it reminds me of Gandhi and other people. Could you say just if, in your knowledge, he was real because that was automatic and genuine behavior, or was a very enlightened politician that would choose to do so in order to have a cause and effect happening? Or he was just naturally, without thinking, he would go back to his farm. he would have to borrow money to go to the capital?
It's a really good question, and I'll tell you what I know but I leave the judgment to you. Washington's ambition in life, he grew up, he was of the Virginia aristocracy, but he was of the lowest level of it. His part of the family didn't have much at all. But the other side of his family was extremely wealthy. They had thousands and thousands of acres of land at that time, and they had slaves, by the way. And as all of them, most of the founding fathers did. His one ambition in life, because he didn't have the physical property, was he wanted to become a soldier and rise up in the British Army. So he volunteered to join the fight in what was called the French and Indian War, when the British fought with the French and the Indians, which was about 10 years before the revolution broke out. And he was the only colonist who rose to an officer's position leading the militia, the colonial militia, that fought alongside the British against the French. And interestingly enough, every battle they lost. The only thing that became really clear during that time was this man is absolutely fearless. And I think Giannotti's going to talk to it, so I don't have to illustrate it further, but he just was physically like Churchill, just physically fearless. He would be standing there when everybody's running, and he'll be standing there facing the opposition and saying, turn around, go in the other. He was a soldier, an officer. But the key point in his life, very interesting from our point of view of accomplishment, was the British refused to recognize him on the equal basis of the British soldiers. So even when he was at a higher level officer in the colonial militia, the lower level officers in the British Army refused to take orders from him. One thing he wanted to be recognized as an English gentleman. And if you read the details, it's very fascinating, because he ordered his beds and his coach and his clothes, all came from England at phenomenal expense. He wanted to be a respectable English gentleman, and whatever he did, they refused. They offended him. And if they hadn't, I don't think he would have become the head of the Continental Army. The fact that he recognized, it doesn't speak in high ideals, but it tells something fundamental. The fact that he realized he would never be treated as an equal, as long as the colonies were under the British, was for him personally a very powerful motivating force. Now that's one side of it. On the other side, he really was idealistic when it came to money. He refused to serve and fight for the country taking money. And not just the salary he missed, but his estate, which by that time through inheritance he had 30,000 to 40,000 acres. By that time the whole estate was just declining to the point of impoverishment, because he was away for 8 years. For 8 years he couldn't return to manage his farm. So I think when he wanted to go back to manage his farm, it was, okay, we've won the war, now I have to try to redeem my property. Where he got, you've really asked a question I would like to know the answer more confidently myself. Where he got this attitude, I didn't sense anyone else of the great people around had this commitment so much as he did. He really felt, I don't know where he got it, and maybe that it's not come out in the 2 biographies I've read of him, though they were fascinating, but where he got this idea. But it's also interesting that when the war was over, there was a real movement to make him king, especially among his former soldiers. But even others, he was approached by a number of people and said, we need a new strong leader here. We need a king. And he absolutely found that abhorrent, disgusting, the idea that he said, don't insult me, talking that way in my presence. So I think in one sense, I think he was a reluctant president. He became president very reluctantly. And he came on with the kind of promise that within 2 years they would let him out of it. He was not a gregarious, outgoing political, he was not a political person. He was a quiet person, not even a great communicator, but that's about the extent of my knowledge, and I don't really, you've really asked a question I'd like to find out more about. Where that idealism came from, it's a good question. But fascinating period, isn't it? Anyone who has a chance to learn more about it. Do we have any questions? Okay. Ashok, would you like to say something?
See, so far humanity has been using its mental power, the power of its reasoning, for accomplishing all its aims and ideals. But mind as such has not freed man from problems totally. Many problems still remain. I would say humanity till now has not succeeded in forging human unity. Problems like the problem between Israel and the Arabs, and the Indo-Pakistani problem, and the North Korea-South Korea problem, these political problems elude a solution. Not only that, there are also environmental problems. They are a persisting, nagging problem now. And apart from political and environmental problems, economic problems of recession and unemployment, all these things remain. All these things clearly show that the power of mind is not enough to relieve man totally of problems. So do you think that humanity has recourse to some other superior power that can offset the imperfections of using mind as an accomplishing agent?
Did everyone follow the question?
No.
No? Okay. Ashok's point was that we see that in spite of, I'm just repeating what he said, in spite of the fact that human beings have been exercising mind and mental faculty to solve our problems, we see that many of our problems aren't getting solved. And therefore, he's come to the implied conclusion that there's a limit to what mind can do, at least with mind, the rational mind as we're using it. And therefore, do I think there's any higher power that can solve? He didn't define what that might be, just generally. Other power that could be used that would be capable of solving these problems. I hope I've got the question correct, Ashok. I'd like to go back and challenge the premise. And the premise is that we're using mind to its full power and getting the best we can get from mind. I think all that I hear and see, and the more you learn about how political decisions are made, not only political decisions, how decisions are made in the scientific community, the medical community, in politics, in economics, in business, and everywhere else. There's a lot that doesn't deserve the name of mind, or certainly of rationality. There's a lot of egoism, there's a lot of social construction, there's a lot of prejudice and willful blind prejudice, ignorance in its, there's a lot of direct intention to misunderstand or do what's convenient for us and ignore the consequences if it will in any way impede us. So I think I would first of all question the premise that we are fully utilizing the capacities of mind. And you know, the Academy launched a few years ago. We got started and then we have not continued it as much as it should be. We created a project called The Limits to Rationality. And that project really is addressing the issue that you raised, because the phrase limits to rationality implies, can be, depending on how you interpret it, it could imply that there are limits to what we can do through rational processes, but it can also imply that there are limits to the way we're using rationality. And I think the first is certainly true. And I also agree, I think there is a limit to what we can do through rationality the way we are using it now. In fact, on the last day in the morning, I have a talk called Ways of Knowing, in which I'm going to try to talk about, at the best, where we're using rational processes, where we're trying to be dispassionate, unegoistic, idealistic. Still, there are characteristic ways in which we are using the mind, which are the source of problems, or have limitations in their knowledge. So I will come back and address that point later on Saturday. But it's a good question. Thank you. Anyone else? Yes.
Thank you very much for the presentation. Again, it was very interesting and inspiring and thought-provoking. And my question is about the energy and about it being concentrated in cities, as you said. And you gave two examples of visiting New York and Eastern Berlin, and the difference of energies was sensed there. I would like to know, can it be possible that different nations can have different levels of energy, like the potential level of energy of different peoples? It can be easily explained why it was in Berlin at that time, because the situation was like that, and in New York, as it was a free city. But the general idea is, for example, is the level of the potential level of the Americans and the Japanese and Norwegians can be different.
Very good, very interesting question. I think the first thing I'd like to say is, and I tried to address it yesterday, is the energy level of a person or a city or a country can vary enormously over time. When we say it's a depression, when we're in an economic recession or an economic depression, at one level of that energy, we mean the energy has gone down. The enthusiasm has gone down. The expressiveness, creativeness, and initiative has gone down. And we know also in all the East European countries that were suppressed for so long, I think we know and have seen what happened when the Iron Curtain was lifted and the Cold War ended and how much the energy came up. I mentioned in India my experience. 40 years ago, even in the center of Madras, a city at that time of 3-4 million people, I felt like it was an American village. Just everything was so quiet and today, you just feel the energy. Harlan Cleveland, the past president of the World Academy, who worked as the Assistant Secretary of State under Kennedy during the Cuban Missile Crisis, he was in charge of American aid in the Far East, in Korea and Taiwan and all, after World War II. And he saw this energy getting released and awakened in East Asia at that time, and he coined a phrase for it called the revolution of rising expectations. And that phrase, which has come into the English language, he's actually been, it's been traced back to him. He's the original author of that phrase, because he saw, I said, energy comes from aspirations. But aspirations not that are suppressed and hidden and concealed inside, but when they have an opportunity to express themselves. When Mrs. Bennett sees Mr. Bingley, suddenly her energy comes to the fore. So my first answer would be that for all of us, and that's what I got from Alberto's comment yesterday, that autonomy is a condition in which we are able to actualize ourselves. Autonomy, freedom, is a condition in which we're able to bring our own energy, our own aspirations to the fore when we're being forced to conform, or when our movements of any type are we're being taught what to think, taught what to feel, taught how to behave. That doesn't release the energy, then we do the minimum. So I think we all have a potential for going from what level we are to a period of maximum inspiration and maximum creativity. And I think that's the premise of the humanistic psychology as well. That's one answer to you. The second answer, again, I'm going back to what I said yesterday, there are different types of energy. For Michael Jordan, I don't know if you know Michael Jordan, they called him Air Jordan because when you see this guy get up in the air, it literally looks like he's hanging up there. He stays up there. That must take a lot of energy. I mean, his energy, he may be a wonderful person in other respects, but you see the phenomenal, not just energy, but organization and skill and attitude. He had wonderful attitude the man had. He never tried, he was the greatest player of all time, but he never asserted himself. He was a quiet person. He used his energy in his body and his work, not in his ego. It's my impression anyway from what little I know of him. But look at the Renaissance, Italy, and Florence and places like that during that rare period. What a tremendous efflorescence of creative energy. There was, incidentally, and my understanding of it is, the Renaissance was found, the basis for the Renaissance, and I think Alberto even mentioned it, was there was a long history of a few centuries of commercial development and commercial prosperity, which formed the economic basis for a Renaissance where the wealthy people could afford to pay other people just to build artworks and not be working otherwise for their living. So there was an economic basis, a physically productive basis of energy for it. But this was an outflowering of energy, intellectual, creative energy, that, like ancient Athens, it was a peak moment in humanity. So there are all types of energy. I was yesterday talking about the rich emotional intensity, which I see more in Europe than I see the more you go east, I see more and more of it. And although I found it in India, expressing differently in different places, but different types of energy than the pure intellectual or mental or pragmatic or whatever else. We each society, to me, when I think of humanity, I think of humanity as the human potential is so complex that no country, no individual can express all our potential. No country can develop all the human potentials. So we kind of have a specialization here, a division of labor, not by some intention, but where each society is developing some strand of the human capacity and then putting it back in the pot and sharing it with the rest of us. So we're still drawing the benefits from what the Greeks did 2,200 years ago and what the Romans did 2,000 years ago and what the Renaissance Italians did 500 years ago and so forth and so on. And we're all gaining from that. So rather than think, I hope that we're not going to all develop the same. I think we can each develop to a maximum intensity, and humanity needs that diversity. The development of the emotional intensity, the mental intensity, the spiritual intensity, the artistic intensity, the physical beauty and harmony that the Japanese have achieved. I wish the whole world looked like a Japanese garden. And maybe ultimately, somewhere along the line, that we're going to be able to integrate all of these energies in a way of life and human development and social development that's unimaginable to us today because we're really at the primitive beginnings of a long journey. I hope that answers your question in some way.
Thank you.
Good question.